So I'm going to talk you through Exposure by Wilfred Owen. As you'll know, he was a soldier poet. This is somebody with first-hand experience of conflict. He fought during the First World War. He died a week before the war ended. These are very much based on personal experiences. It's a massively powerful poem, but interesting in terms of conflict because it doesn't take the traditional angle in terms of looking at the enemy, but in terms of the Germans, but looks at the other enemies that soldiers face. The title is massively interesting, but I will come back to it because of the fact that it has multiple meanings. It's polysemic, just a fancy word for multiple meanings. And I think we can only really appreciate the range of meanings by the time we've got to the end of the poem, so we'll come back and look at the title at the very end. What really fascinates me about this, and I've alluded to it before, is that actually the enemy, the Germans that you would expect in World War I, aren't mentioned at all, really. They're alluded to, but actually there is a far greater enemy in this poem, and as you will know, it's the weather and the cold. And so the poem starts with 4 stanzas that really set the scene of the weather, and the weather is very much personified. The winds are talked about. They're described as merciless, they are icy, they knife the soldiers because they're so cold. And this idea, this metaphor, is essentially run through the whole poem. Later on in the poem, we have the rain soaking, we have the stormy clouds, and then really, really kind of importantly in the 4th stanza, we have the snow. And actually, this is probably my favourite stanza to kind of capture the personification happening in this poem. What we have through stanzas 1, 2 and 3 is the weather, as we know, kind of increasingly getting worse and more uncomfortable for the soldiers. By stanza 4, actually it's as if the weather is actively attacking the soldiers. So not the Germans, but the weather. It's the air is black with snow. Usually you associate white with snow, and obviously Owen is turning the connotations of that on its head. The snow, the flakes, the flowing flakes, flock, pause and renew, which again I think are really interesting choices of verbs here. This makes it sound as if the snow is deliberately attacking. It's a thinking, sentient being. It's making choices of where it goes and what it acts on. And the soldiers can do nothing but watch the snow doing this to them. And in fact, as the stanza 4 begins, whilst there might be sounds of bullets streaking the silence, the danger that we would typically associate with the war, these bullets are actually perceived as being less deadly than the snow, because the snow is basically everywhere. It's following them, it's attacking them, as I say, with that flock, pause and renew. Those 3 verbs really kind of getting the deliberate nature of the choices that the snow seems to be making, and they can't escape this. And this sense of their hopelessness, again, is really presented in the first 4 stanzas as well, through a range of techniques. I think really though the most powerful one for me in terms of the techniques being used in this opening stanza for their hopelessness at the 4 endings of each stanzas. In the first, we have the winds obviously being described. The soldiers are awake, it's night time, they are waiting, but nothing happens. And this sense of waiting and the hopelessness of the waiting, I think, is captured through the ellipsis happening at the end of each line, which you see carry on in stanza 3 as well. It's almost like pregnant pauses. These soldiers are waiting. The reader is encouraged to wait with the soldiers. What is going to happen next? Is there going to be an attack? The soldiers are worried by silence. The sentries are whispering. They're curious and nervous. The sibilance there kind of gets that shh, the fact that they are talking to one another, very worried. But nothing happens. And that line is repeated again and again. And finally becomes our very final line in the poem. This repetition of these lines, and the fact that actually every line of every stanza is cut short, it's half the length of the lines of the previous stanzas, it kind of creates this moment of waiting, and then it's cut short, and there is just, again, another pause. Nothing is happening. And I guess that kind of conveys the hopelessness of their time at war, as does the question that gets asked here. And actually there's another question here as well. Our speaker here is questioning their very being. Why are we here? Again, that seems to convey the hopelessness and the helplessness of them, because it's not answered directly, and actually they don't know why they're here, because the reason they're there, which is war, but nothing is happening. They're just waiting, and I guess that anxiety that must be built up there must be quite overwhelming for them. So we get the sense of the overwhelming nature and the suffering that they're having. Their brains are aching. They talk about the agonies. And crucially, and I guess this links in with the question that they're asking here, what are we doing here? The only answer that comes, the only answer that they can offer is here. We only know. And what do they know about war? Well, it lasts. The rain is wet, and it's often very stormy and cloudy. The weather is against us. There is nothing about the Germans there. There's nothing about the enemy. In fact, the only army that's mentioned, the only enemy that is mentioned, is in this line here. The shivering ranks of grey followed on underneath. And actually that's the start of a new day. A new day. The repetitive nature of what is happening to them. That's the enemy. That's the army that they seem to be fighting here, not the Germans. And again, sort of to carry on with that idea, and we've mentioned this before, the one line where the enemy and their action probably is really introduced is here. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Again, the sibilance coming across there gets the sort of the speed of the sound of the bullets firing across, and it's a nice contrast with the pause that we've just had. But again, these bullets are less deadly than the snow. So even when we do have the true enemy being introduced, it's with kind of a very quick moment, but actually everything else around them is far more intense. So the opening of the poem really sets the scene. A huge amount of pathetic fallacy, a huge amount of personification of the weather, of the difficulties of the men's lives, and just how desperate they are feeling. And then this then carries on, but Owen also changes the focus of the poem in the next couple of stanzas. And that essentially is where I guess the heart of the message of this poem really is, but it's a tricky section, and there is lots of debate about it, so we will spend some time looking at this now. Stanza 5 begins again with the weather, the snow. It's kind of the danger of it that is probably best captured by this. It links in with this sense of it actively plotting against them. The cold, the snow comes upon them stealth, like sneakily, like it comes feeling for them, and the men are trying to protect themselves from it. They're cringing in shell holes. Usually that would be from an attack, but actually it's from the weather in this moment. And when they're there and when they're hiding, their mind takes them somewhere else. And this is where we start to have the change in the poem. Their mind takes them back to forgotten dreams. It takes them back, not from the from the snow days ditches, but into grassier ditches where we've kind of got the idea of warmth coming through. And they drowse sundoes littered with blossoms, trickling where the blackbird fusses. All of these are words and phrases which we'd associate with spring, of new life. And their minds are taking them back to somewhere happier, somewhere very different to the place that they are. But then this stanza ends with, is it that we are dying? Is their mind, is their mind playing tricks on them? Are they kind of having a flashback to a previous life? And this idea is then continued on into the next stanza. And this, for me, is the most important stanza to try and understand. It's difficult, I think. It's taken me a long time to kind of make my own mind up what I think is happening here. There's lots of debate about what is happening. But this stanza takes us back home, back to England. So again, their memory is taking them back. Slowly our ghost strikes home. They're not literally dead at this moment, but in their mind, kind of that they're taking themselves back and remembering what home was really like, a real contrast to what's going on here. Now, all poems kind of have a kernel, a hard nut that you need to crack where the message lies, and this is the kernel of this poem. They go back home. The warmth is alluded to. There are fires there. We've got the wealth, the welcome, the jewels, the positivity that you might attach with that. However, jewels are hard, they're not a warm thing, and we sort of see that the hardness and the coldness, they're not warmly welcome back home, is continued in the rest of the stanza. Humans aren't there, the mice are there, the house is theirs, but actually the human life is closed off. The shutters and doors are closed, and in fact it's repeated on us. The shutters and doors are all closed. And I think that repetition of a line is to kind of capture the heartlessness potentially from the soldier's point of view of people back home. They are not welcome. People don't want to remember them or think about what is happening out there. And so things are closed to them. They're not welcome. And again, what's interesting in this poem and in this line, it's an us, just as the poem starts off. The pronouns in this poem are collective. This isn't one person's individual experience. This is something that all soldiers experience. They are all involved in this. They all feel as if they're kind of cut off from the world in which they belong. And so their only option is, and this is their, kind of an incredibly powerful line, because everything is closed to them, they turn back to what they know they can do. And what they know they can do is fighting in the war. That's why they're there. But it's not called that. It's simply we turn back to our dying. That's essentially what their role is, to sacrifice themselves. And this idea then is continued in the next stanza. It could be argued, if you sort of say, we're turning back to our dying, that this is a poem in which, he's very miserable about this. It could almost seem as if he's a bit of a coward, he's afraid of what's coming, and actually he argues that he's not, and soldiers are not. We believe this is our duty. We know that we need to keep the home fires burning. This is kind of a cliche phrase that is associated with life back at home. The soldiers are fighting to preserve what is British, what is Britain, and the home fires, the family protected. The sun should smile on child, on field, on fruit. So we are protecting our beloved home nation. But even though they're not loath, they're not afraid, they're not unwilling to do this. So in the final two lines of this stanza, and he starts to sort of shift the focus back, we're not afraid of doing this, we're not unwilling to do this. But it links back to the question, why, what we're doing here, why are we doing this? Because actually what they're fighting for, this patriotic love of country, or of God, because of the attitudes at the time, it seems as if they're questioning the existence of God. The love of God seems dying because of what they're seeing, because of the atrocious conditions that they're living in and fighting in. How could a benevolent, kind God put them in this kind of situation? And then the poem quickly jumps back to present time. We've gone back in sort of time and in memory to the home and why they're there, but then it brings us back to this night, to tonight. So the poem begins at night time, moves then to the coming of the morning in stanza 3, takes us through a day where nothing happens, takes us back in time to their memories, and then drops us right back in to the night time, exactly where the poem started off. We've got a circular structure happening here. And what happens in that night? Well, the weather comes back. We've got the frost again, the cold. And what does it do? It fastens on them. A really interesting choice of description there. Closes them in. It shrivels them. It puckers them. When you're so cold, everything tightens up. And that's what it does to the living soldiers. And then we're taking on and we're zooming in on the burying party, those soldiers sent up into no man's land to try and rescue some of the bodies that they wouldn't be able to do so during the day. And the burying party are out in no man's land. Again, it's freezing, and they're looking at the faces of the bodies that they're finding. And the bodies' eyes are described as ice, again, kind of to show that there is no life within them, which we wouldn't expect. But again, it's a word that we associate with the weather. So dead or alive, you're suffering in exactly the same way. And perhaps with all their eyes are ice, could that be the bodies that they're uncovering, the half-known faces? Or could it actually be the soldiers, the burying party? They've lost emotion now, they are hardened to this experience. And despite the fact that it's cold, still nothing happens. So I've talked about this circular nature of the poem. Time-wise, it starts at night time. It takes us through a day and ends back at the evening time, and we just know that their existence is going to be exactly the same day after day after day, because nothing happens. So we've got kind of feelings in this poem, and we've talked about the you know, the soldiers and their suffering and perhaps their boredom and their frustration. But we have absolute feelings of stasis in this poem. Nothing is moving, nothing is changing. They cannot escape the situation that they're in. And that helplessness, because of that, I think comes across really powerfully in this poem. In that respect, for me, it links to London. There is an absolute helplessness in Blake's London. There's even a hapless, a hopeless, unlucky, unfortunate soldier in there as well, like we have in this poem. But in terms of other connections that you can make, obvious comparisons are Bayonet Charge and Charge of the Light Brigade, poems which actively deal with soldiers in war, but obviously from very different perspectives. It also links in terms of the weather and the impact that the weather can have on individuals and the environment to Storm on the Island as well. So it's a poem definitely worth knowing because of kind of the beauty of the ideas that Owen is portraying to the reader, you know, the very pity and horror of war, which is what he intended to get across. But it also links really well with some of the key poems in the anthology too. So it's worth having a look at the connections that you can find. So finally, at the start, we talked about the title and I said, oh, it's polysemic, it's got a lot of different meanings, but it's only when you get to the end that you fully know what that is. I mean, the literal link to it is exposure is a condition that people can die of, exposure to the weather. But I think that Owen wants us to take it far more than that. He's really, and it ties in with the central kernel of this poem, the main message, he's exposing the people back home to, one, the realities of the situation that the soldiers are in. He's exposing us to the truth of how difficult their conditions are. But he's also exposing something that the soldiers believe, that the people back at home have lost interest or do not care or choose not to care, choose to be ignorant of the situation that the soldiers are in. He's also expressing something and exposing his own feelings, perhaps about the nature of God and religion, the fact that, you know, he feels that there is no hope for them anymore. Can there possibly be a God in this kind of world? So it's a poem which kind of exposes his own suffering, his own internal conflict. But remember that because the pronouns in this poem are collective, he's suggesting that actually many men feel this way, and he's exposing the scale of this disillusion to his readers, to the people back home.